I've always found it unique that there is an Amelia Earhart line of luggage, and I've always wondered, why would you name a line of luggage after someone who was lost and never found? That just seems weird to me, but that's a separate thing. Do you like a good mystery? And I mean a really good mystery, the kind of mystery where in some cases the best and the brightest haven't been able to figure it out yet. Well, aviation is full of those stories, and they go back 100 years. We could start with Nungesser and Coley. You probably know about Charles Lindbergh, 1927, flying from New York to Paris and becoming a worldwide celebrity. Aviation was suddenly practical and useful around the world. But he wasn't the first to try that. It actually didn't work out too well for those who came before him. Mr. Nungesser and Mr. Coley were Frenchmen, pilots from World War I. They decided to go the other way, take off in Paris and fly west to New York. They did just that. Maybe. They took off on May 8th, 1927. They were seen flying over Ireland, headed to the west, and that was it. They were never seen again. Somewhere out there, they and their airplane, the White Bird, a big white biplane, the remnants of it are still out there, maybe at the bottom of the ocean. Some people think in the North Woods of Maine. Nobody's really sure, but people do keep looking for it. 10 years later, one of the most famous people in the world, Amelia Earhart, set off with her navigator, Fred Noonan, to circumnavigate the entire globe by air. A remarkable story. Now, some people think that it was a publicity stunt. Some people think it was actually intended to advance aviation on the world stage. Some people think it was a spy mission for the U.S. government. Nobody really knows, and maybe nobody ever really will know. Amelia and Fred intended to make a fuel stop at a tiny little speck of an island way out in the middle of the ocean called Howland Island. Unfortunately, they never arrived. Or if they did, they didn't arrive at the island. They arrived someplace else. People heard them on the radio. There was a search for them, but nobody ever found what happened to Amelia and Fred and their airplane. People still look. There's actually a charity organization that has made it their entire mission to find that airplane and the remains of Amelia and Fred, if possible, and solve the mystery of what happened to some of the most famous people in the world on their trip. Sometimes things just don't go your way. By the way, Howland Island is so remote, it's roughly halfway between Australia and Hawaii, which in itself is a series of islands way out there in the Pacific. The world is a big place. The ocean is very big. It's possible to get lost. At least 100 years ago, it certainly was. One of the more famous disappearances that happened right here in the United States happened in 1945. December 1945, to be specific, Flight 19. 5 Avenger aircraft, which are big single-engine torpedo bombers from the World War II era, the exact same airplane President George H.W. Bush flew when he was a young man in World War II. They went on a training mission from the east coast of Florida. This should have been no big deal, but for some reason, they may have gotten disoriented. There are several theories that the person leading the training mission was actually from the west coast of Florida and not the east coast, and was convinced if they flew to the east, they would eventually hit Florida again. Nobody really knows, but 5 very large single-engine torpedo bombers disappeared in 1945 and have never been seen again. The crews weren't recovered. Those aircraft are out there someplace, and someday somebody may find them. But it's one of those mysteries that just goes on, and it's something that really intrigues people because there is something to find. These are metal aircraft with big hunking metal engines. World War II airplanes are discovered in the ocean or in lakes or in woods all the time. Somewhere these are out there, and I guarantee you somebody continues looking for them to this very day. Now, it would be easy to say, well, yeah, these things happened a long time ago. That was a long time ago. Radar wasn't even common back then. Radio communications weren't ubiquitous. Not all aircraft had them. We didn't have the weather gathering information that we have now. There are a lot of good reasons why an aircraft and a pilot and their passengers might go missing in the 20s. Or the 30s, or even the 1940s. But what about a Boeing 777 in the 21st century? You probably remember this, but Malaysia Air had a flight that went missing in 2018. There was a huge furor over it about who was tracking what and why don't they have a radar return on that? And that flight was the thing that taught an awful lot of people that radar actually only covers a relatively small area. Over land, we can connect all those different radars to get a composite of what's going on. But when you're out over the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, there is no radar tracking you out there. And that was kind of the thing with the Malaysian flight that disappeared in 2018 with its pilot and its crew and its passengers. The flight was from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, or at least that was what the destination was supposed to be. There are theories on what happened to this plane, the most prevalent one being the captain actually diverted the aircraft, took it where he wanted to go, and that was that. That may be true, but we don't know for sure. I suspect someday someone will find that airplane because it's enough of a story to keep looking for it. Pieces of it have supposedly washed up on beaches here and there, and let's face it, if an airplane that big, a Boeing 777, hits the water at any speed, parts are going to break off. Some of them will float. The currents will take it where the currents take it. It's entirely possible someday someone will find that aircraft and figure out what did happen, because on that aircraft there are black boxes, and that may be the answer. Or maybe it won't be. You never can tell. Steve Fawcett was a very wealthy man. He was an adventurer. He was the Richard Branson kind of guy, but the American version. He held world records flying around the world in a single-engine aircraft. He flew a jet aircraft around the entire world. He was an accomplished guy by any measure. And one day, in 2007, he just went for a leisure flight in a super decathlon. Something many of us have done, something many of us will do. Nothing unusual about it at all. Except Steve never came back. For all his adventures, for all his successes, for everything he'd done in his life that said Steve Fawcett is a winner, Steve Fawcett went on a pleasure flight and disappeared. Just gone. Now, they do search and rescue whenever somebody goes missing. They do their best to try and find this aircraft. And by they, I mean family members, news crews, the Civil Air Patrol. A lot of people get involved in this sort of thing. They genuinely try to find the aircraft and rescue survivors if they can. That search for Steve Fawcett was large and it was long, and they actually found aircraft that had crashed years ago and never been found before. But they didn't find Steve Fawcett's aircraft. It wasn't until a year later. A hiker, just out on a hike, came across a wallet beside the trail, and that wallet belonged to Steve Fawcett. That discovery is what led searchers to the remains of the airplane, and unfortunately the realization that Steve Fawcett was gone. Sometimes we find what we're looking for. Sometimes the mystery does get resolved, as it did in the case of Steve Fawcett. We do find the wreckage and know what happened to the people in the aircraft. But that's not always the case. And whether that's the Malaysian Boeing 777, or whether that's Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan with their Lockheed, or whether it is Nungesser and Coley and the Whitebird, sometimes they're just gone. Part of the reason I bring this up is because these are great mystery stories. They do have a legitimate aeronautical bent to them. These are people who were very accomplished in many cases, who really did know their stuff, but for one reason or another, that last flight just didn't work out for them. Part of the reason I find this so fascinating, and I really always have, but when it was really reinforced for me, was back in the year 2000. In October 2000, a gentleman by the name of Hubert Helliger, who lived in Kissimmee, Florida, came down to Winter Haven, Florida, where I'm based, and rented a Cessna 150 from the FBO. He'd done that before. He'd done that many times before. Hubert was what you might call a regular renter. He was about my age, mid-60s, and he went off on just a pleasure flight, as we do. Now, being October, in Florida, the weather is just spectacular. It really was a nice day. It was a perfectly good aircraft. Hubert took off, climbed up into the sky, and never came back. To this day, nobody really knows what happened to Hubert Helliger. Now, he was flying a Cessna 150, so he had about 3 hours of fuel at the best, maybe 3.5. It cruises at 90-ish knots, so he probably couldn't have gotten too far out of the state of Florida. But you know, people think the world is overpopulated, especially people who live in cities or sprawling suburban areas. Those of us who fly know once you get up in the air, most of America is very green with large bodies of water. There's a lot of farms, there's a lot of woods. Here in Florida, which, you know, when my granddad was born in 1898, there were 750,000 people here. Now it's like 20 million people. There are major cities, Jacksonville, Orlando, Tampa, Miami, big places. But there are also massive expanses of nothing. The green swamp is just miles and miles of vegetation. The Everglades, same thing. And of course, we've got the Gulf of Mexico to the west and the Atlantic to the east. There are a lot of places a Cessna 150 could go and just disappear. And in Hubert Helliger's case, it did. So we have to ask ourselves, could this happen to you? Could it happen to me? What's the likelihood that we'll go rent an airplane from our local FBO, or if we're fortunate enough to own a plane, jump in our Cessna 182 and head off for the horizon? What are the odds we just disappear and never come back? The good news is that's less likely than ever before, thanks to ADS-B. ADS-B out is a requirement for aircraft that are going to be any place that a Mode C transponder was required. There are exceptions. If you're just specifically staying in Gulf or Echo airspace, you don't have to have ADS-B, but it's become so affordable and it is useful to ATC. And if we have ADS-B in that helps us track other traffic, that's really worth it for us. So that's become a really common thing in general aviation aircraft. The odds of you disappearing off the face of the earth are extremely slim. Now, that's not to say you'll never be lost, or as we prefer to say, momentarily disoriented. That does happen, especially in the pre-GPS days. But the idea of somebody in a general aviation airplane or a commercial airplane or a charter airplane just disappearing off the face of the earth, that's pretty unlikely these days. And that's good, because that adds a level of safety to aviation that we all wish for. And frankly, a greater level of safety is a really good thing to shoot for. But we do have all these mysteries that predate ADS-B. We have Nundersur and Coley out there. We have Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan that we can still look for. Nobody really knows where Malaysia 777 went, and Hubert Helliger is just out there somewhere. So keep your eyes open if you're out flying around in the desert, if you're out tromping through the woods. You never know what you might find that turns you into a news item because you discovered the missing aircraft or the missing pilot that people have been looking for all these years. I hope you enjoy that story. I gotta admit, it's one that just sticks in the back of my brain because there are some really compelling aviation stories from history, and what connects us to those is we fly now. And it's still 3-axis control, elevators, rudders, and ailerons. It's still just air pressure. And what they did, what you do, what I do, there's a commonality to it. So go out there and enjoy flying. Do your best to stay in touch with everyone. Let people know where you're going. Use flight following or file a flight plan. Let's be safe out there, but let's be out there. See you next time.